Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program, Vaping, Edibles, and the New Marijuana, What Every Parent Needs to Know. My name is Emily Larkin. I am the Thriving Youth Program Director at the Community Fund of Darien. And in my role, I coordinate the efforts of the Thriving Youth Task Force and work with our brand new Drug-Free Communities grant. As many of you know, this fall we were awarded a 5-year, $625,000 grant by the CDC aimed at addressing teen alcohol use and teen marijuana use in Darien, which is what brings us here together tonight. We are pleased to welcome 3 local experts who will share their insights with us. First, Darien Police Chief Don Anderson has served the department since 1983 and began his tenure as police chief in Darien in 2019. John Hamilton is president and CEO of Liberation Programs, one of Fairfield County's leading behavioral health organizations specializing in treatment and prevention for all types of substance use disorders. Liberation works with adults, youth, and families. John is a licensed alcohol and drug counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And finally, Susanna Lewis will moderate the first portion of tonight's event. Susanna holds a master's degree in public health and is the director of community relations at Silver Hill Hospital. Established in 1930, Silver Hill is a private, non-for-profit psychiatric hospital and is nationally recognized for its work in mental health and addiction treatment. So I'll turn it over to Susanna in a second, who will share some opening remarks and then pose some key questions about marijuana to Chief Anderson and John Hamilton. Then we'll leave plenty of time for an audience Q&A, so please submit any questions to me, the host, via the direct chat button at the bottom of your screen. So as a final housekeeping note, this event is being recorded and slides will be made available. We'll email everything to you tomorrow. So thank you again for being here, and I'll turn it over to Susanna.
Thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm so glad to be able to be part of this conversation on behalf of Silver Hill tonight. We want to say a special thank you first to all the parents who are here listening tonight. I was reminded of a comment that clinical psychologist Mitch Dickey made last summer when members of the task force were going through all of the student survey data. And we were finishing a meeting, and he said one of the clearest takeaways from this data is that parents are the most underutilized resource in this community's prevention and mental health efforts. So special thank you to the parents who are here and engaged and learning. So before we start the Q&A, we wanted to set the stage by just saying a little bit more about what is the new marijuana. What do we mean when we use that term? And it's a substance that is changing not only in our relationship to it as a community in virtue of its legalization, but it's also the substance itself that we are talking about is a very different one than what many of us understand it to be. Specifically, the potency of marijuana has changed dramatically since sort of late 60s, early 70s. A lot of us have sort of concept of marijuana as the Woodstock drug, and a lot of historical sort of perceptions and images that were formed therefrom. But in fact, the substance is a very different one than what that was. In the late 60s and 1970, the THC content, which that's the psychoactive and addictive component of marijuana, was about 1%. And that has gradually ticked up over time. It was about 4% in the 1980s. By 1995, it was at 5%. And then over the last 30 years, it has continued to grow, and currently sort of THC plants can have anywhere from a 20 to 40% concentration. Marijuana plants can have anywhere from a 20 to 40% concentration of THC. So dramatically different. Similarly, concentrates. So, if people are vaping marijuana, dabbing, all of these kind of alternative mechanisms of consuming the drug, those concentrates have been on the market since the mid 2000s. In about 2010, the concentration was about 7 or 8%. And by 2019, it was 76%. So dramatically higher. And important to note with that too is that sort of the pre-filled cartridges, which if kids, anybody, when they're vaping, that's the most frequent go-to. Pre-filled cartridges have been found to have higher than 99% THC content. So we're talking about a very different drug than what we had in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And specifically sort of any marijuana that has a higher concentration of THC than 10% is classified as high potency. So we're talking about concentrations that are dramatically higher than that. And specifically above that 10% threshold is where we see direct correlations. And I mean, we're at the point, I think we can say causation between THC use and psychosis. And just sort of as one data point further to that, the Connecticut Department of Public Health itself between 2016 and 2019 reported a 300% increase in hospitalizations for psychosis that were connected with high potency cannabis use. So, and that's one of the effects. There are a lot. And so with that kind of backdrop, I think we're in a good place to start our Q&A. And we're going to start with John Hamilton. So John, as a first question for you, how addictive is marijuana, and how does age of first use make a difference in that?
Thanks, Susanna. Well, I guess the answer would be, it depends on when you start. I'm going to cover that in a little bit, but it is actually very addicting. And Emily, if you can, I put some slides together just to give people some information. I always like to start out with just the understanding of drugs in the brain. This comes from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. Simply, individuals, kids, adults do drugs for two reasons: to feel good or feel better. If you're doing drugs to feel good, you may get through life unscathed, but now with compromised marijuana, and they actually did have the first documented case in Connecticut in the country of contaminated marijuana with fentanyl found just last week. And this is a real concern. So even somebody who's doing drugs to feel good on a first time use could end up with tragedy because you don't know what you're getting. But for the most part, at liberation programs, we're seeing people that may have started drugs to feel good, but now they're doing it to feel better. It's self-medication for anxiety, for worry, for trauma, for hopelessness. It's disconnection to their feelings. It's disconnection to their friends and families. It's disconnection to their school. Whereas having it feel good is connection. And we always like to say that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. So it's all about connecting with family, connecting to your community in a way that has individuals feel lovable, capable, and connected. Next slide. So that said, this is actually diagnostic criteria for addiction and addiction for cannabis. So all you need with all these bullets is 2 or more of these bullets to say yes to, accompanied by significant impairment in functioning and distress in your life, and you qualify for cannabis addiction. What I see most often is continued use despite consequences, and continued use despite awareness of problems attributed to use, and then tolerance and withdrawal. But if you answer yes to any of these 2 bullets, and by the way, all these slides will be made available to everyone on this call, you qualify for a diagnosis for addiction to cannabis. Next slide, please. Going back to what's the risk? For the general population, If you're exposed to tobacco, 32% of people will be addicted. Heroin, 23%. Cocaine, 17%. Alcohol, 15%. Sedatives, 9%. And cannabis, THC, 9%. However, that's the general population. Can you click one more click, Emily? If you start, it's all about age of onset. We know so much about the neuroplasticity of the brain that the earlier age of onset, the greater risk. If you start before the age of 18, you take 17% and add it to all of these percentages. So now a kid who starts vaping before the age of 18 will have a 16% chance of being addicted to cannabis. One more click though, Emily, if you may. If you start before the age of 15, you take 25 to 50% of these numbers, add to these numbers on top. So what does this mean? Kids that are vaping tobacco today will have over an 80% chance of being addicted to tobacco in their lifetime. And they'll have, again, 60% chance of being addicted to cannabis in their lifetime. By that increased exposure at an early age increases risk. Next slide. So for the most part, addiction is a pediatric disease. The earlier you start in the age of onset, the greater the risk, both for alcohol use, nicotine, and cannabis. And we have the data to support this. We know if kids start binge drinking before the age of 14 or 15, they'll have a 40% chance of having a problem with alcohol in their lifetime. And that's not even looking at genetic predisposition. So a same thing with cannabis. The earlier the onset, the greater the risk for addiction. Next slide, please. I think this is my next question.
Yes, this is your next question. So, John, if you could talk some about how today's marijuana affects cognitive functioning and specifically sort of the mental health effects of use.
And I got some slides for this too, Suzanne. I've got the best and brightest slides from the best experts in the field on this. The dose matters, but as I said, early onset increases poor cognition functioning, and your IQ will decline. It increases your likelihood for anxiety issues, because there's a real confusion in the general population that initially it's an anti-analytic. So people think it actually reduces their likelihood for anxiety, but ultimately creates more anxiety. You need to develop skills over pills and use of marijuana and drugs to really be able to mood regulate and be able to deal with your anxiety. It does increase the likelihood of depression, and it's been well documented that it puts a risk at the first episode of psychosis and early onset for a psychosis. Next slide. All the studies, when they combine all the studies, they basically said that use of marijuana heavily you score worse on all these tests: attention, verbal learning, memory, and processing speed. And by the way, you will even score poorly when you're not even high, just from the results of marijuana, again, from the use in chronic use. Next slide. So what we do know is those who develop marijuana dependency before the age of 18, again, it's that vulnerability of the brain, right? The brain doesn't completely develop for women at 24, men 25, some men 40, but that's a whole nother talk. And we know that the earlier the brain gets exposed to these drugs, the more it compromises, particularly their IQ. So the longer their dependency can persist, the greater the decline, with actually documented decline of 8 IQ points for the most persistent users. And those who began using in adulthood did not show this IQ decline. So if you started when your brain is developed, you're not at risk of reduction of IQ. But even those who quit in adulthood, they could not restore their functioning if they began using in adolescence. So the key is that age of onset. Next slide.
Okay. So then, John, what are some of the ways in which marijuana is available to be consumed? Because that's another aspect of the drug that has changed a lot over time.
Yes, I got some slides on this one too. Okay, so this is just some visuals. So you either can smoke marijuana, there's edibles, you could put it in beverages, vaporizing, or actually capsules, sprays, even tincture. There's many different ways. Next slide. Here are some examples of like gummy bears that look like pretty benign gummy bears. And obviously a lot of this marketing for youth obviously looks like Kit Kat bars, but they're not. All of what looks like candy in this photo is not. It is all edibles, which is a very common form of being able to ingest this THC, and again, can be very dangerous for young kids who don't know the harmful effects. Next slide. And Susanna, you spoke about the concentrates. Here's some of the examples of the concentrate: the wax, the earwax, the hash oil, the shatter, the butter. All of these have intense level of THC concentrate in their use. Next slide. What is the most common and popular form of vaping, though, is the Juul. People have heard of this. It's rampant through the schools in Connecticut and through the country as well. But we've seen a doubling in the increase in vaping in the last 7 years. And the Juuls look like these really small containers. So they're very, very easy to, and very sleek and very easy to be able to hide. So kids can actually do this in school. And it is one of the most popular forms of vaping. Next slide. Next question.
Next question. So you spoke a little bit to this point before, but can you say a bit more about the correlations that are being found between marijuana use and academic achievement, as well as professional and educational outcomes?
Yes, I can. Roll the slides, Emily. This is the most extensive study. Sadly enough, because of the schedule of marijuana, it has not been able to be studied by the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So we had to rely on other countries studying it. And the most extensive, elaborate study was done in New Zealand. And this study is very, very compelling in looking at the number of individuals with use of marijuana longitudinally over their lifetime and the impact of that use. So specifically in New Zealand, if you used marijuana in a 6-year period between ages from 14 to 21, 400 times, and if you do the math, that's only twice a week, you have a 2% chance of graduating college versus a much greater chance, I think that says over 36% chance if you didn't and just used, never used. Your chances of being unemployed, 52%, and your chances of having somebody in the welfare or being on the welfare system, more than 50%. This is the most significant study that's ever been done because it's been done over time, and it just shows that increased exposure over time, over the years, has significant impact, particularly on reduction of performance, both in work and in school. Next slide.
Great. So then, for all the parents who are here tonight talking to their kids about marijuana, how can they start that conversation?
I got some scripts here just to make it easy. First thing I want to do is point out to people that you need an escape plan. So if your kids are involved in a party, in a high-risk situation, they need to know that you are going to pick them up, no questions asked. And that, so basically the first thing you want to start with is if you're ever in an unsafe situation, whether it's alcohol, drugs, or anything going on, you know, you could text me, even if it's 2 o'clock in the morning. And all I'll say when I pick you up in the car is thank you. No other questions asked. And that opens the door for a lifeline for kids to get out of very unsafe and maybe very dangerous situations. That's where we have to start. Next slide. And then if you want to have a conversation, you could start with tonight's conversation, but maybe you don't want to talk about it tonight. So tomorrow you say, hey, you know, I listened to this Zoom presentation on vaping and new marijuana yesterday, and it was an eye-opener, scared the hell out of me. I have to say, I was pretty clueless about all the different types of marijuana that are out there today in your world and what's going on in your school. I hope you know that you can always talk to me about what's going on in your school and in your life in general. I hope you know there's nothing you can say or do or anything that you've done that's ever going to change the way I love you. Again, this seems like the obvious to parents, but it's not. Believe me, I've worked for many years with families, helping them navigate some of these conversations. I believe you were always making the best decisions available to you at the time. I have faith in you. Please let me know how I can be helpful. And I hope I give you the message that I believe in you and have faith in you. And please let me know, what messages am I giving you that is standing in the way of you knowing that I love you unconditionally and have hope and faith? That's the first conversation starter. That'll set a nice tone. Next slide. So here's another one. So I listened to this Zoom presentation on vaping and the new marijuana, and they pointed out how important it was for teens to talk to their parents and know where they stand on marijuana use. Hey, I'm just checking in to see if we're clear on where we stand on these issues, and let me know if it sounds unreasonable. We may not always agree, but I want to understand where we stand on these issues, whether we're on the same page, in the same chapter, or even in the same book. So let's have that conversation now. Because as you saw in the earlier slide that Emily started this presentation out with, a lot of parents say they had these conversations with their kids, but the kids don't really remember them. There's a big disconnect there. Next. Next slide.
Okay. Emily May. Okay.
There we go.
I think she.
So sorry, that was the last slide.
Oh, that's good. Keith, you're up.
And to that last point, though, you know, one of the things we have seen in Darien's own data that, you know, top predictors and sort of protective factors for kids in whether or not they decide to start using whatever the substance is sort of clear understanding of parental expectations and rules. So that's a big one that we've seen in what our own kids have told us. So thank you so much, John. That's great. Sort of health background and information about the effects of marijuana on mental health, physical health, those sorts of factors. And now we're going to talk a little bit about legalization and what that looks like for Darien, for the state, for our community as a whole, and for our kids. And I'm going to just highlight a couple of things about Connecticut's law before Chief Anderson starts that I think are helpful to just have in mind, because it's about a 200-page bill, I think. So it's a lot to digest. So first of all, potency limits, because that's what we're talking a lot about with the effects of marijuana. The new law does set limits. So the THC content limit for marijuana plants is capped at 30%, and for concentrates, it's capped at 60%. So again, still dramatically above sort of where we start to classify high potency cannabis. A really important note in those limits is that there is a loophole, and pre-filled cartridges, which again are kind of the easiest go-to for kids or anybody if they want to be vaping, you know, these substances are exempt from these limits. So essentially, sort of one of the most widely accessed sort of forms of consumption has slipped through this part of the law. Retail sales in Connecticut, they can begin as early as May of this year. So, and it is within the law that individual municipalities can decide not to allow retail outlets in their communities. And so that detail underscores how important it is going to be for individual communities to partner with their neighboring communities. For instance, we know from our data that kids in Darien frequently don't buy alcohol in Darien. They go to Norwalk or Stamford. And so similarly, if we have those, if you know, our neighboring communities do allow dispensaries and Darien doesn't, we're going to have to be working sort of collaboratively to enforce the laws that are in place and that kind of thing. At the same time, that municipalities can opt out of dispensaries and retail outlets. By 2023, every household will be allowed to have up to 12 marijuana plants. And it's important to note that when we're talking about a marijuana plant, we're not talking about a nice sort of, you know, pot of basil or something like that. These mature marijuana plants are sort of tree-like. They're sizable and substantial. So that's a lot of marijuana that's being allowed in an individual household. And then just in this final point about the law, which I think is just stands to reason, but it was really salient to me nonetheless when I read it. As of January 1st, marijuana use, possession, or sale in schools cannot be disciplined any more severely than alcohol. So it's a substance that's really been put right on par with alcohol. And that's in effect now. So those are a couple of bullet points about some of the big points that are in the law. And now we have some questions for Chief Anderson. So could you talk about sort of, now that marijuana is legal in Connecticut, what are the laws regarding those under 21 as it relates to marijuana? And also, how do those compare to laws regarding underage possession of alcohol, kind of in the community at large?
Well, it is a pleasure to be here tonight. I always like to start off my comments by saying that, you know, the police department and police officers are part of the executive branch. We're not legislative and we're not judicial. We don't make these laws and we don't interpret these laws. Now, if you go down to the library and the copy of War and Peace is checked out, you may want to get this RERACA marijuana legislation, because on my desk here, it's almost 4 inches thick of all the documentation that I have on this. So it is going to take some time through case law to kind of wade through all the nuances of this law. This is the first time in my 38-year career, I believe, that a substance that was once illegal is now legal for the most part. Folks need to remember that this, you know, it's the responsible and equitable regulation of adult use cannabis. That's what the statute is called, and it's RERACA is the acronym. This is an adult cannabis bill. This does not apply to those under the age of 21. So the way this is, it's kind of a tiered approach for people of different ages and having different amounts of cannabis. So if you're under the age of 18, your first offense is a written warning. That is what the law calls for. So if you are under 18 in possession of under 1.5 ounces of marijuana, you're looking at a written warning and potential referral to a youth service board, which you have a juvenile review board here in Darien. For a second offense, it's a mandatory youth service board referral. Again, no arrest. And third offense of possession of small amounts of marijuana would be considered a delinquent act. So it's not an arrest if you're under the age of 18. If you have 5 ounces or more, it's a juvenile delinquent act and you would be going to juvenile court. Okay, now the second tier is the 18 to 20-year-old, where if you have 1.5 ounces of marijuana and you're under the age of 21 but over 18, you will sign a health statement for your first offense, and you will be looking at a fine of $50. Your second offense between 18 and 20 with a small amount of marijuana is $150. And if you have more than that, over 5 ounces between 18 and 20, you're looking at a Class D misdemeanor where you'd have to go to court. This is it's difficult. And the first thing they tell a police officer the first day in the police academy is officer is bound to know the law. This law requires a secret decoder ring and a cheat sheet to really keep all the nuances of this law in place. So really it is geared toward adult marijuana use. And there are still provisions for under the age of 21. It's not criminal activity, but it's regulated activity that you cannot do under the age of 21.
Thank you. And are those regulations similar to those for alcohol, or are they different?
It is similar. Now, through the course of my career, they have lessened the possession of alcohol consequences for young people. But while that was happening, they have a DMV, Department of Motor Vehicle component that has come into play. So if you were caught with alcohol and you are under the age of 21, you're looking typically at a license suspension if you have a driver's license, even if you didn't have alcohol in a car, but you were in a minor in possession of alcohol, you're looking at a license suspension. Same thing's going to be for cannabis. I think the DMV probably is going to suspend your license whether or not you were in the car at the time you had cannabis. Again, that's one of those things that we're looking at case law, and we're going to look at judicial review to see how that plays out. Little bit different than alcohol, and in the fact that possession of alcohol by a minor is a mail-in fine if you are over the age of 16. Now here, if you're 16, you're not going to get an infraction with a mail-in fine because you're under the age of 18. So there's nuanced differences between alcohol and cannabis. I do think at some point in history, you're going to see them coming together where there's going to be more consistency between alcohol and marijuana. One very important difference here is here in the state of Connecticut, that if you allow a minor to possess marijuana on your property, say there's a party at your house, right, and they're smoking marijuana, that is a infractable offense. But the way marijuana works here now by statute, again, I think this is something that's going to have to come together. If you provide marijuana to an underage person, it's a misdemeanor. If you provide alcohol to a minor, it is still a felony. So there's something in the law that I think is going to have to be looked at and addressed. I'm not so sure they're going to make giving marijuana to a juvenile a felony. I think we may see something swinging on the alcohol where it's not a felony. But again, that's judicial and legislative. It's not executive on part of the police. Just one of the things that came up in this law.
Great. Thank you so much. And do you have any sense from what you've seen so far in Darien? I mean, the law is very new, so not sure how much you have seen, but where kids are accessing marijuana?
Well, in my career, that has not changed.
Okay.
For the folks of our vintage, right, the marijuana availability has really not changed. We're a 35-minute ride on the New Haven line to the 125th Street. We're in between cities of Norwalk and Stamford. We're a 20-minute ride from Bridgeport. A lot of the kids here in Darien are getting it from other kids in Darien. Somebody makes a ride to get some. They don't consider themselves a marijuana dealer, whether it's legal now or illegal like it was in the past. They go get a supply of marijuana for their own use, and they can sell off extra. So they're basically getting their marijuana for free. So that has never really changed. I'm not Pollyannish. I don't think that will change. Where it's coming from is remained pretty consistent, I think, throughout the course of my career.
Okay. Well, and interesting to note with that too is that a lot of that is probably street marijuana because it's underage, under the radar. John alluded to this. Maybe you can say a little bit more about it. But we've had a lot of cases in Connecticut recently of drugs being laced with fentanyl, which is highly, highly concerning when you start to think about marijuana. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, there have been cases of marijuana laced with fentanyl. There's some that they originally think it was, and it turns out it wasn't. You know, we had the case in Hartford where we had the overdose fatality of a young student in the last week or two. They had a second case where they thought the students were eating candy laced with fentanyl, and that is still yet to be determined whether or not there was actual fentanyl in that substance or not. But clearly, this is a major concern for me and my officers. Fentanyl, for folks who have not read anything on this subject, is very, very dangerous in very small amounts, to the fact that all of our police cars are equipped with naloxone so we can treat overdose of fentanyl and or heroin. And we also have it, to be quite frank, in the event the officer might get fentanyl dust on himself or herself, that they can self-treat or treat another officer. That's how quick and fast acting it is and how deadly it can be. So the fact that there isn't potential for marijuana laced with fentanyl out there is very concerning to me, because someone in their first time may have never smoked marijuana or had an edible marijuana gummy before. There may be a substance in there that it's going to be problematic for them very, very quickly. And we see it across the state and across the country.
Absolutely. Great. And then just sort of as one of the leaders in Darien, a community leader around our safety and our well-being here, is there anything in particular that you would like people to know about sort of the marijuana that's out there today or the law?
Well, when it comes to public safety, we take an overarching look. We want all our people to be safe. And I can tell you through my experience, through 38 years of working here, most of the majorly traumatic events that I've dealt with, whether it's family disputes or whether it's major car crashes or bar fights, or somehow substance abuse has been related to many, many of those. I can't tell you how many times, a lot of times when the people in Darien don't see the police department until they really need them, and they're in crisis mode at that point. So I can tell you how many of these cases and how many of these families have been pulled apart by addiction, including marijuana, right? Do I think marijuana is a gateway drug? John is the expert here. He can probably weigh in, or you, for some people, for many people, it is. Maybe it's not for everyone, but I think it is for a goodly amount of people. And the mere fact that any substance, whether it's alcohol or cannabis, just weighs in on making choices that are not smart, with major league consequences sometimes. So we don't profess that we think everyone is going to be a teetotaler or that everyone's going to obey the law to the letter, but we do want to have a safe community here. And I can, from firsthand experience, tell you I've dealt with hundreds of young people here with serious issues with addiction over the course of my career. Some grave, some not so bad. Some outgrow it, some do not. So.
Thank you so much, both of you. So we have left a healthy 20-minute chunk for Q&A so that all of you can ask the questions that have come up. And Emily is going to moderate that portion of the discussion.
Yes. Thank you so much for all of those insights. We have a lot of questions coming in, and I think we'll have time to get to all of them. So I'll start with the first question. The question is, isn't the addiction rate to cannabis similar to the addiction rate to caffeine and less than the addiction rate to alcohol? What are the withdrawal symptoms when someone stops using cannabis? John, I might give this one to you.
Sure. I don't have the actual rates of caffeine addiction in front of me, but I do know it's considered a diagnosis to be addicted to caffeine with taking too much, and there actually are some withdrawal symptoms. But the rates of addiction to cannabis are similar to the rates of addiction to alcohol. And as you saw earlier in my slides, to the general population, they're both 9%, 9 to 10%, depending on the study you look at, for the general population. And both for alcohol and for marijuana, the earlier the age onset, the greater likelihood that rate's going to go up. So as I said, for kids starting drinking at 14, it's a 40% chance they'll have a problem with alcohol. And we talked about this in the past, Emily. It's about delaying that age of onset, delay. And that's, if you cut it from 14 to 16, it cuts it in half. 16 to 18, it cuts it in half. We have no reason to believe that wouldn't be the same experience because of what we know about vulnerability in the dopamine system and the brain, neuroplasticity for marijuana as well. So people are also confused by marijuana. Well, it's not like heroin and alcohol with these severe withdrawal symptoms and benzodiazepines, which you could actually die of coming cold turkey through withdrawal. They're right. It's not like that, but it's still there. And there are studies that show that there is a physiological withdrawal from use of cannabis. And some of the most common symptoms are irritability, craving, restlessness, sleep disturbances, depression, aggression, and anger from withdrawal of cannabis.
Thank you so much. And we have a question, I think speaking to one of John's slides with these gummy bears and edibles, the question is, how can candy-like marketing be allowed? Should we be advocating for policy and law changes to avoid misleading promotional materials? Otherwise, aren't we looking at another Oxycontin crisis bound to happen?
Wow.
I might give this one to you, John.
That's from my friend Alexandra, who's does some really cool stuff and makes recovery the new cool. And she's absolutely right. There has been clear strategies in marketing. They pretty much stole from the tobacco industry of how to market to youth and get away with it, with cartoon characters and gummy bears and sweetening in the vapes. And they have started restrictions now legislatively and on being able to have the sweetening of the vapes, and they are moving in the direction for greater regulation, but we have a long way to go. And going back to even what the chief said before about like gateway drugs, it's really important to note, as the chief said, there are many people that will use marijuana that will never go to heroin or fentanyl. However, in my agency at Liberation Programs, almost everyone I know, over 1,000 of our recoveries, as we call it, our clients that are heroin addicts, now fentanyl, have a full-blown fentanyl addiction. Close to 100% of them started with marijuana. So that's important to know.
Absolutely.
And if I can just add to that point, Emily, we did in our last set of survey data, when we were asking questions specifically around opioids, there were not a high percentage of Darien kids who were using opioids, but of those who were, the highest predictive factor for that was marijuana use. So again, it is the opioid piece. We're very fortunate was not a raging problem in Darien, but the correlation was clear in our data.
Absolutely. And a related question just came through. How do we prevent our stores from selling it in town? Will this be sold in Darien? And maybe Chief Anderson, I think you might be able to speak to that.
Well, currently sale of marijuana is not yet legal. So it's coming down the pike. Where right now you can gift it to someone, and some enterprising people in some cities here in Connecticut have gotten around where they're having gifting parties on the weekend where they gift you the marijuana and then you make a donation if you so choose. Dispensaries are coming down the pike, and municipalities get to decide whether or not they want to have a dispensary in their town. What the town of Darien or no municipality can do, you cannot restrict the delivery of cannabis to your residents. So the town cannot say you are not allowed to deliver, or gift marijuana to anyone in Darien. So the Planning and Zoning Commission did ask for both me and the Police Commission to kind of start formulating a plan and a hypothesis on the potential for a dispensary here in Darien. I'm not a public policy maker. Again, I'm part of the executive branch here, but from my reasonable man doctrine, I'm not sure that a dispensary would work in Darien for the simple economics of what rent would be and whether or not there would be enough supported traffic for a cannabis dispensary. There are pretty stringent laws and rules going to be put on that dispensary of where it can be, that you can't have your wares visible from the street, and the town can enact reasonable rules to keep it in certain locations. That remains to be seen whether or not we're going to get a dispensary here in Darien. I would think probably not. From a simple commerce and economic standpoint, I think if someone was going to have one of these, I think it would be more economically feasible for them to go to one of the bigger cities around us. So we'll see.
All right. And I think this might be another question for Chief Anderson that's just come in. The question is, anything including cannabis that has been laced with fentanyl is horrible. Do you believe this occurrence will go down once cannabis is regulated and tested before sale?
I think you probably would see a decrease, but anyone who thinks that if you want to call it the non-legal sale of marijuana is going to be completely eradicated, that's simply not going to happen. There are plenty of people that don't want their neighbors to see them walking out of a liquor store, perhaps, or maybe even the grocery store to see what they're buying. I don't think they're going to want to come out of the cannabis establishment on a regular basis either. So the off-brand or illegal sale of marijuana is going to continue. I'm not a marijuana consumer in any way, shape, or form, but if I was, I would probably go toward the legal dispensary, even if it was more money, to ensure that the downside that we've been talking about here with the laced the laced marijuana would not happen. Clearly, the regulated marijuana, if you want to call it safer, it may be safer because you know you're not getting the foreign substances. Whether or not it's safe, that is beyond something that I'm willing to say tonight. But there's still going to be sales, as there always has been, even though if we have a dispensary, clearly.
And just to sort of piggyback on that a little bit, going back to Chief Anderson's point about where kids are accessing marijuana, they're largely, it's not going to be the regulated stuff from the dispensaries in a lot of cases, because it's not going to be legal. And so that's a particularly worrisome point when we're thinking about our kids and marijuana consumption, and something that we'll have to pay really close attention to.
Absolutely. We've got another question coming in asking about medical cannabis use. The question is, if someone under 25 years old uses cannabis for medical reasons, how do you recommend they speak to others, friends, other parents, school officials about their medical cannabis use? John, any thoughts on this one?
I do have some thoughts on this one, yes. And, you know, a lot of people would see that medical marijuana is really the Trojan horse for legalization, because at the end of the day, it was like across the country, legislators, determining medical best practices. And if you look at the real research, 50 clinical trials, the most extensive study ever done on the quality of marijuana for medical problems, they can only find evidence for chronic pain, neuropathic pain, glaucoma, and spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis. Meanwhile, there's like in almost every state, it has different diagnoses that can give you a medical marijuana card. Some 20, 17, 19. Connecticut most recently included chronic pain on their list. And Connecticut was one of the first to have actually post-traumatic stress disorder on the list as well. So if you look at, and cancer, if you look at all these divergent diagnoses, right? I mean, there's crazy diagnoses, they're all over the map. The common characteristic is suffering. And so oftentimes it's not the gold standard for what a person should be taking, it's relieving their suffering, not their symptoms outside of the four medical diagnosis that actually do show that they have efficacy. It's still not even considered the gold standard in those. There are other treatments, but the best treatment oftentimes is the treatment people are going to take. It takes the suffering away that goes generally with chronic pain from a chronic disease, or just the sense of knowing you have a chronic disease and how you're basically suffering with that. So that's what that's about. So I don't know who this person is under 25 and what conversations they have, but if they want to be painfully, honest, it's relieving their suffering and some of the anxiety around dealing with a disease.
Thank you, John. We have another question coming in for Chief Anderson. Will the police use the same diagnostic tools for impaired driving under weed as they will for alcohol? How will that be assessed?
That is an excellent question, and one that is still going to have to play out over the next couple of years. The answer is yes. Ultimately, there's going to be training for all police officers and what's called advanced roadside impaired driving enforcement. That's going to be part of our recertification paradigm. Also, there's going to be additional drug recognition experts trained in the state of Connecticut. Right now, I think there's only less than 50 across the state. The issue is for many, many years, as most people know, there's what's called a per se provision in the DMV regulations for operating a motor vehicle under the influence of alcohol. It was 0.10 for years, and about 20 years ago went to 0.08. That is a go, no-go line where if you are at 0.08 or above, you are legally believed to be under the influence. There's been judicial notice taken that people that are 0.08 or higher are impaired driving. There's no such roadside test that we can do right now on marijuana for that. There's companies that are diligently trying to create equipment that has a scientific, standard, and it's accurate, and it's, valid and reliable. You can use it time and time again. So there's something for operating under the influence of marijuana is still going to take a little bit of time, but yes, you can still be charged with operating under the influence of marijuana based on the totality of the circumstance and what happens during the stop. One very strange part of this statute, to be quite frank, is the fact that they said for alcohol, you cannot consume alcohol while you're driving a motor vehicle. That's a specific tenet of a Connecticut state statute. You cannot consume alcohol while you're driving. Your passenger is free to consume alcohol, but for marijuana, they have made it where you cannot consume marijuana while you're operating a motor vehicle, nor can your passenger consume marijuana or cannabis while they're a passenger in your vehicle. However, now this is the kicker that makes me scratch my head a little bit. In that same part of the law, they said the police cannot pull you over for that. They cannot pull you over for consuming cannabis while you are driving. So that's the only reason that the police officer sees someone smoking a bong and the bong smoke is coming out the window. If that's the only violation that we see, we are precluded from stopping you for that. So just kind of strange part of the law.
And we do know in Colorado that deaths did go up with young adults once commercialization happened of marijuana. So we have some compelling data to say, to go with what the chief's saying. We've got to come up with these tests sooner than later, because it does. We have data to show it will increase the rise in automobile fatalities, and we have that data from Colorado.
Yeah, and I think the exact data, and this is from Smart Approaches to Marijuana, is that it is now involved in 1 in every 4 road deaths in Colorado.
Thank you for that addition. That's very sobering. We've got a few more questions.
Nice play on words. I saw that, what you did
So,
there, Emily.
yes. So another question is coming in from a parent of a 15-year-old. She writes, my 15-year-old daughter told me that disposable vaping is less nicotine, 5%, than the chargeables. She's obviously trying to feel out and understand herself what she's hearing. I started some research and was overwhelmed by all the amounts and percentages that are available. Any help to understand the strengths as comparable to packs of cigarettes? I love your data on addiction. I think this is to John. That will help with part of her question.
Yeah. And again, it's a great question. And it's also important to note that our young adults, they are masters in research and social media and actually getting a lot of the facts and the data. So she's right. They're all over the map on different levels of nicotine regarding what vehicle you use. And Canada actually was trying to do the first study on cannabis across the country and study the use of cannabis. But it goes back to just what I think is referenced in this question is you can't measure a dose because it depends on the route of administration and the vehicle in which you're taking it. They can't get an accurate assessment of how much THC someone's taking in to make one dose the same as another dose that would make it a clean scientific study. So it is very, very hard to determine. There's very little control sometimes, even with those with tobacco and nicotine, which you think is regulated. They've done these tests to find out they're nowhere close to what they say is in it. And it's all over the map. So there is some concerns there, which is a good point. I think I had some tips for parents. I don't know if you're going to release those too.
Yes, we've got one more kind of public health question, and then maybe we could pull those up in closing. So Susanna, I think this one might be for you. The question is, considering this is a pretty significant change, making marijuana legal, especially with the percentages being way above the addictive risks, what are our Connecticut government officials doing to manage the change? Has anyone discussed this with other states which have already been through this process for a few years?
So actually, I joined a legislative forum a couple of weeks ago, which was jointly coordinated between Norwalk and Westport to kind of what I was saying before about municipalities needing to coordinate with each other. And two of Representative Steinberg and Representative Stein, who are both connected with Westport partially, I'm not sure whether it's Norwalk too or what their full districts are, were really taken aback at sort of hearing this data and why they had not heard it sooner, why kind of the Public Health Committee in Hartford had not been more actively sort of consulted in this process. And so that was a real sort of point that came up, and they were very clear that one of the things that they are really all about advocating for will be changing these concentration limits. And I think sort of, you know, the horse has left the barn. Legalization has happened. And so it is going to be now kind of what can we do to mitigate the effects and sort of harm reduction. And I think, you know, from, you know, John was talking about New Zealand before, and there's a study that came out of the Netherlands, which is another place that, you know, it's been a little bit longer there, so they have some longitudinal data, and they ultimately ended up capping THC limits at 15%. So just a hair above that 10%, but dramatically lower. And that was kind of the point at which they started to see sort of what to them seemed like sort of a reasonable mitigation of sort of psychosis, other mental health effects, physical health effects. And so I think that's going to be a really important piece of advocacy that you know, everybody will, it's important to sort of be talking to your legislatures at this point, because the law is just going into effect. So obviously sort of now is the time when there's going to be sort of the most discussion about it and what needs to change and what needs revision and that kind of thing.
Thank you. And I just realized there are a few questions coming in through the chat that didn't arrive in the Q&A box. So I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. Does that sound okay to everyone?
Sure.
Okay, these two
We'll
feel
stay on
important
for a little bit. Yeah.
So I'm happy to touch on them. So the question is, there are a lot of stories about kids in Darien being too scared to call the police if a friend has had too much to drink or too much cannabis because they don't want to get in trouble. So Chief Anderson, is there a safe way for kids to call the police and get help for a friend who is in danger? And I know we have Youth Detective Mark Capelli on the line too. So Mark, you're welcome to chime in on this as well.
Well, one, I think, good provision of the RERACA law is they specifically spell out that if you're making a good faith effort to provide medical care and provide for safety of someone who might be under the influence of an intoxicant of any type, you are protected from any type of criminal charges.
Good Samaritan Law.
So time and time again, I have said this to every organization that I've ever spoken to. It is our main thrust at the Darien Police Department to keep our kids safe. That is what we do. That is what we try to do. And we go to an underage drinking party or a marijuana party, our main concern is to get those kids home safe so they get to get up the next morning and continue on with their life, right? That's really what we come down on. We are not going to arrest our way out of a marijuana party or an underage drinking party. That's not going to be the benchmark of whether or not we're successful or not. It's whether or not we're showing our children here that what they should be doing, and when they make wrong choices, that they have a escape clause, right? And it's not a tragedy. So yes, the law specifically spells out that you would be protected from any type of charging. And if you call anonymously, we will come and try to ensure the safety of all.
And someone's asking, can you repeat the name of that law?
The Good Samaritan Law.
Excellent. And we have just two more clarifying questions referencing earlier points in the presentation. Someone's asking, what exactly do you mean, this is for John, when you refer to psychosis? Is it broadly referring to mental illness? If so, what are the most prevalent types of psychosis among young adults?
No, and it's specific psychotic break. It's a specific first episode psychotic break that would cause somebody to be hospitalized with schizophrenia, and psychosis is very serious. We're not talking about a broad definition of mental illness, a very specific kind of myopic scope, a psychotic break.
And let me just jump on that. I'm not a clinician, I'm not a practitioner, but I am, again, I'm a trained observer of human behavior. And the amount of incidents now where we have young people being taken to the hospital for psychotic type activity or mental distress has increased exponentially, say over the last 10 years, in both age and severity. We never saw this, and we're seeing this with all too amazing regularity as of late. So whether or not that's substance abuse or it's some other type of disorder, the police on a regular basis are attending to folks that are in severe crisis.
And THC-induced psychosis can actually result in bipolar too. That happens all the time. The chance of having a first psychotic episode at an early age increases the likelihood to having a second psychotic episode. And we don't know who's going to have that psychotic episode. And I want to just point out, just like as we talked about, there's tainted marijuana that we've now demonstrated, not as many cases as they thought, but there was documentation that there's tainted marijuana with fentanyl. And just like hearing that, marijuana can cause a psychotic break, we have to be very careful to give our kids a message that's not going to insult their intelligence or their experience, because for most people, they won't get psychotic. Most people, they won't be fentanyl. Tragically, some people that will happen, but we can't go with a scared straight message. We've learned well about that. We have to give a message based on facts that's reasonable to their experience and their intelligence. Don't insult these kids' intelligence. Don't try to scare them straight. Try to have a conversation with them.
Mm-hmm. And kind of to that point, I think we'll have this be our final question of the night, but know that if there are questions you want to follow up with, you have great resources. You're welcome to email me or the Thriving Youth Task Force, and we can get you answers. But a final question, speaking to getting this message to youth, this is such an amazing and informative presentation. How do we get kids to see it, listen to it? Can we create YouTube videos and flood the kids with them? And I am so happy to share in closing that the task force with our Drug-Free Communities grant funding is working on a comprehensive adult marijuana educational campaign and a campaign for students that will be not insulting their intelligence, meeting them where they are, and sharing reliable information so they can make safe, healthy decisions.
And I have to say, Emily, the one on that you did for underage drinking was fantastic. The best I've seen in any community. So just keep up the good work.
Well, thank you. And we're so lucky to have a community with so many stakeholders in all different sectors that really care about our students and want to see them grow up safe and healthy. So with that, I'm seeing a few more questions come in, but perhaps we can send a few responses in our follow-up email. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much, Chief Anderson, Susanna, John. We really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us. And in closing, for all who attended tonight, know that tomorrow you will be getting an email with a recording of this event, with John's wonderful slides, and with a link to the Thriving Youth Task Force resource page, where we have some excellent resources for parents about talking to their kids about marijuana and alcohol, and some other great resources. So keep an eye out for that email, and for our social media campaigns that'll be launching in February and March. So thank you, everyone, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.
Good night. Pleasure to be here.
Night, everyone. Thanks, Emily. We got those tips too. We'll give those to the parents.